Jesus Christ, the messenger about whom this religion is based. For example, if this is the year 2007, that means it is supposedly 2007 years after the birth of Jesus Christ, though no one knows for certain when his birth actually occurred. So we see how relative this scale is, yet everybody will assuredly tell you, for instance, that today is July 13, 2007, or whatever day it might be, even though this is merely a fiction of the mind. And they are serious. When we place this date on cosmic history timescale, where 1 second equals 400 years, then we see that we are in the final nanosecond of the blink of the cosmic eye. In most cases, when historians talk about the history of the world, they are merely talking about the history of the human since the dawn of civilization. This is merely the last 13 seconds of cosmic history time, yet humans insist on thinking their brief little history of the world is the whole of history. This is an example of human arrogance and ignorance, thinking the history of its own species is the entirety of the history of the world. Let us look at 3 examples of books written on the history of humans. Note that each one is erroneously entitled. First, we will examine the Time Chart History of the World 1997 by the Millennium Trust. It is called World History, though it is merely a neo-biblical history of human doings. This book has a timeline of 6,000 years, human history of the world, beginning with Adam and Eve in 4004 BC. The first chart ranges in time from BC 4004 to the time of Noah, followed by another sequence going to the Tower of Babel, where it appears human history began, sometime around 2500 BC. When you get to the modern world, the time chart indicates an exponential increase and a dizzying multiplication of information streams. The history also includes a chart of kings, major wars, and great inventions, ending with the cloning of sheep of 1996. The next example, by Christos Konditis, is slightly more scientific and is also called The History of the World, 6,000 Years of World History. This particular history of the world, which is another timeline presentation, shows that writing began around BC 3100. History and writing go hand in hand, as history is the written word. The first 2 foldouts of this next span, from 4000 BC to 100 AD, this is 4100 years of history. This means that the rest of the 10 foldouts contain the last 1900 years. The last foldout from 1940 to 1990 is only 50 years, compared to 4100 years of the first 2 foldouts. There is an increasing compression of events to the scale of time the closer you get to the present moment. This is also evident in the third example of Cassell's Atlas of the World History in 3 volumes. The first volume takes us up to sometime less than 1,000 years ago. The second volume spans from about 1,000 years ago to 1783, and the third volume covers the years 1783 to 2000. This means that the third volume spans 217 years, compared with about 1,000 years for the second and 4,000 years for the first volume. This indicates an exponential increase of information and events the closer you get to the present, the final nanosecond of the 13.7 billion years of cosmic history. In the cosmic history perception, life on Earth is the acceleration of information propagated exponentially according to the law of binary progression. So we see that, more often than not, what we call human history is confused as world history, and what scholars call the history of the world is really the history of civilization. Civilization is what occurred when humans took it upon themselves to cluster their habitations into large conglomerations that evolved into what we call the modern city. It is also generally assumed by historians that human history started about 6,000 years ago. Some more progressive history books take a little bit more of a scientific view and tell about the Earth, but most view history as the creation of cities, the rise of agriculture, and the spread of writing. More recently, writers like H.G. Wells, Hendrik van Loon, and Arnold Toynbee wrote more elaborate histories of the world, but again, these only describe the history of human doings. This point of view also demonstrates that human history is actually correlated to the development of the human personality and the ego as its driving factor. It is only the human ego that assumes that its history is the most important history. Yet it is also true that human history might be the most significant factor in the shaping of the world, and is also its potential destruction. This is ultimately what human history leads to. When we look at the time charts, the closer we get to the present moment, there is more proliferation of human population, and thus human events. There are now more than 190 different nations recognized. This means there are more than 190 different constitutions, and each of these constitutions represents the manifestation of a collective ego bound together by a particular flag that represents a particular nation-state. These collective egos then create allegiance to the artificial nation-state, disregarding the fact that they are actually operating within a much larger organic biospheric field.